The text message sat unread on Ethan Cole's phone for almost an hour. Blind date tonight, 7:00 p.m. Don't cancel this time. Trust me, Mia. He stared at it from the parking lot of St. Vincent Medical Center, exhaustion pressing into his bones harder than the December cold. Inside the hospital, his father was sleeping after another round of chemotherapy. Outside, the city moved like nothing had changed. Cars rushed past. Coffee shops glowed warm against the dark. Somewhere nearby, people laughed about weekend plans while Ethan stood beside his truck, wondering how life had become, something he barely recognized anymore. 3 years earlier, he had been engaged. 2 years earlier, his fiancée left after deciding she couldn't build a future around hospitals and responsibilities. Now at 34, Ethan spent most nights balancing construction deadlines during the day and hospital visits at night. Romance had slowly become something that belonged to other people. He typed the reply 3 separate times. Can't make it, then maybe another time, then finally. I'll try. He almost didn't send it, but his younger sister Mia had been relentless for weeks. You deserve one evening that isn't about work or dad, she told him earlier that morning. One dinner, one conversation, that's all. Ethan didn't believe in blind dates anymore, or timing, or fate. Still, 6:42 p.m., he found himself walking into a small Italian restaurant downtown, wearing the only clean button-up shirt he could find in his apartment. The hostess smiled politely. Table for Cole. He nodded as she led him toward the back corner of the restaurant. Ethan prepared himself for awkward small talk, forced smiles, and an hour of pretending his life wasn't falling apart. Then he saw her. She was standing near the window, adjusting the sleeve of a dark green sweater while nervously looking toward the entrance. And for a second, Ethan forgot how to breathe. Not because she looked perfect, because she looked real. Tired eyes, gentle smile, hair slightly messy, like she'd rushed to get there after a long day. There was something quietly familiar about the loneliness she carried. When she noticed him approaching, she stood quickly. Ethan, yeah, he said softly. You must be Sophie. Looks like we both actually showed up. He laughed at that, surprising himself. Barely. Same. They sat across from each other, and for the first few minutes, the conversation stumbled awkwardly between weatherwork and how aggressively Mia had apparently arranged the date. But slowly something shifted. Sophie wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't performing happiness or pretending life was perfect. When Ethan admitted he spent most evenings at the hospital with his father, her expression changed immediately, not with pity but understanding. My mom was sick for a long time, she said quietly. I know what that kind of exhaustion feels like. The words settled between them gently, not forced, not dramatic. True. For the first time in years, Ethan felt himself relax. Dinner stretched longer than either expected. They talked about childhood memories, terrible jobs, favorite movies, and how adulthood felt nothing like people promised. Sophie worked as an elementary school counselor on the south side of Chicago. She told stories about kids who carried too much pain too young, and how sometimes the smallest kindness changed everything. One of my students cried because someone remembered his birthday, she said softly. That's when you realize how hungry people are for love. Ethan watched her carefully as she spoke, noticed how deeply she meant every word, and somewhere during dessert, he realized he didn't want the night to end. Then his phone rang. Hoss! His stomach dropped instantly. I'm sorry, he muttered, standing quickly. I have to take this. Sophie nodded. Of course, Ethan stepped outside into the freezing air and answered immediately. Hello, Mr. Cole, a nurse said gently. Your father had some complications. We need you to come in. Fear hit him so hard his knees nearly buckled. I'm on my way. When he walked back inside, Sophie stood before he even spoke. What happened? My dad, you should go. I'm really sorry, he said. I didn't mean for Ethan. Her voice softened. Go be with your family. The sincerity in her eyes caught him off guard. Most people offered sympathy because they felt obligated. Sophie sounded like she genuinely cared. He grabbed his coat quickly. Thank you for tonight. Then he rushed into the snow-covered streets. By the time Ethan reached the hospital, his chest felt tight with panic. But when he arrived at his father's room, he stopped cold because someone was already sitting beside the bed. Sophie. She looked up startled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan stared in confusion. What are you doing here? His father, pale but awake, smiled weakly from the hospital bed. She's been volunteering here for months, he said quietly. Ethan blinked. What? Sophie stood slowly, suddenly nervous. I didn't know this was your dad, she admitted. Not until the nurse said your last name. Ethan looked between them, completely lost. His father chuckled softly. She's the one I told you about. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? The woman from the coffee cart. Then it hit him. Over the past year, Ethan's father had occasionally mentioned a volunteer who spent evenings talking to patients no one visited. The woman who brought extra blankets. The one who stayed with frightened elderly patients during overnight treatments so they wouldn't feel alone. Ethan had never met her until now. She sits with people who don't have family, his father whispered, even after working all day. Sophie looked embarrassed by the attention. It's not a big deal. It is, Ethan said quietly. And suddenly the entire night looked different because the warmth he felt around her wasn't an illusion. This was who she really was, not someone pretending to be compassionate, someone who simply was. A nurse entered carrying medication, and Sophie stepped aside instinctively to help adjust Ethan's father's blankets before anyone asked her to. Small movements, gentle movements, the kind that revealed a person's heart when they thought no one was paying attention. Ethan watched silently, and something inside him cracked open. For so long, life had felt cruel, temporary, disappointing. People left. Promises failed. Love faded under pressure. But here stood a woman spending her free nights comforting strangers in a hospital. She had no obligation to enter. Not for attention, not for recognition, just because she couldn't bear the thought of people suffering alone. When the nurse finished, Sophie grabbed her coat. I should let you be with your dad. Wait. She turned back. Snow drifted softly outside the hospital windows while Ethan searched for the right words. I almost canceled tonight. A small smile touched her lips. I almost did too. No, he said, emotion tightening his throat. You don't understand. I've spent years believing people only stay around until life gets hard. Sophie's expression softened. Then she stepped closer. Hard things don't always push the right people away, she said quietly. The sentence hit him harder than he expected because for the first time in years he wanted to believe it. His father suddenly cleared his throat dramatically from the bed. You know, he muttered, for a man who builds skyscrapers, you sure take forever to notice what's standing in front of you. Sophie burst into laughter. Real laughter, warm and bright and healing, and Ethan laughed too. Not the polite kind, the kind that escapes after carrying sadness for too long. 3 months later, Ethan still visited the hospital often, though now many of those visits ended with late-night coffee in the cafeteria beside Sophie. 6 months later, his father's health slowly began improving. And 1 year later, on a snowy December evening, remarkably similar to the night they met, Ethan stood beside Sophie near the same restaurant window where everything began. You know what's strange? He said. What? If the hospital hadn't called that night, I might never have learned the truth about you. Sophie smiled softly. What truth? Ethan reached for her hand. That kindness like yours still exists. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Not because the words were grand, but because they were honest. And sometimes after life hurts people long enough, honesty becomes the most beautiful gift of all. Outside, snow covered the city in quiet white light, while strangers hurried through the cold, each carrying burdens invisible to everyone else. But inside that small moment, two people who had nearly given up on love stood, holding on to something stronger than coincidence. They stood holding on to proof that even in a world full of disappointment, humanity still had the power to heal broken hearts. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to